Good. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our first Friends from the Field webinar for 2023, Trees in Winter. This is a series, as many of you know, that is co-hosted by Blue Hill Heritage Trust and Island Heritage Trust. And I'm Lander, and I'm the Education Coordinator for Blue Hill Heritage Trust. And Martha Bell is, I think, the Education Coordinator. Is that your title, Martha?
Well, environmental educator, but I do a lot of coordinating as well.
From Island Heritage Trust. And we're really excited to have Susan here with us today to share her knowledge about trees in winter and get us excited about going out there and taking a closer look. And I'm gonna pass it over to Martha and she'll let you know a little bit about how we're gonna communicate in this webinar format today.
Sure. Well, we'll use both the raise your hand feature and the chat feature. So if you can type a question that you might have into the chat feature, we'll be able to monitor that and take questions at the end, unless it's a clarifying question, and we'll interrupt you, Susan, if that's okay. And the raise a hand feature, if you would like to put on your video and ask a question directly after the program, that's an option too. So either one works for us, and really looking forward to the program.
Thank you, Martha. And I just realized on my settings end, I think I just had to change something in the chat box to enable people to communicate with everyone. And I think that that's set. But if it's not, let's see. Actually, I think maybe I just,
if somebody writes a message or two and sees if it works.
Yeah, I noticed that there was nothing in the chat box, so I think I just fixed it. Hopefully we'll see a few responses. Yes, it's working now. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much, Susan, for coming and joining us today.
Oh, I'm really glad to be here. Did you want me to just explain who I am and a little bit about what we're going to do?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. My name's Susan Cottle. I'm a Maine Master Naturalist. Most of us who get certified as Maine Master Naturalists are I find the title a little bit difficult because of that word master. I don't think of myself as a master. I think of myself as a learner, and a very interested learner in the natural world. I do have a keen interest in trees, and I think in a second here I'm going to get my screen to share to start the slide presentation. When I do that, either because of my lack of technical expertise or just because of how electrons work, I'm not going to be seeing anybody. I'll just be seeing my screen. I appreciate that Martha is going to be looking at the chat and perhaps noticing the raising of the hands, and that's fine. I don't mind being interrupted at all, not one bit. Sometimes it's hard to get me to stop, so don't hesitate to speak up, okay? And let's see if I can manage this. Okay, whoops, I can't do that before I do the other thing. 8 things in the chat already, how exciting. And I won't be seeing that anymore. Okay. Let me know when you are seeing my screen.
Susan, we see your screen, and we also see the other slides along the edge.
Yep. Hold on. Now is the time that my cursor is deciding to be uncooperative. So you're not seeing the full screen, you're seeing the combo. Please forgive me, everyone. It's been a little while since I've done a share screen with a slideshow.
Everyone is generally very forgiving on these programs.
Oh,
so
thank goodness. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. There's a setting I need to get to, and for some reason, it won't allow me. Just a second. It will not allow me to switch my screens. Okay. I'm going to try something a little strange. not doing what I want you to do.
It
That
looks
looks
like
good
from
there.
our end.
Just a second. Oh, so is it now solid for you
Yes.
without any additional whatever?
Yes.
Okay. She knows not what she does. Okay, once again, everybody, my name's Susan Cottle, Maine Master Naturalist. And I have a very keen interest in trees. And I think that I imagine that all of you do too. I'm very used to talking to groups and asking them to think about what it is that they like the most about trees, or what it is that they value the most about trees. In this setting with so many people, it's a little bit hard for me to have a preliminary conversation with everybody, which I very much like to do. But I hope you will feel free to share that. And if time permits at the end, I would love to hear more from other people. Maybe we could even unmute people and have a conversation. I don't know. But let's get started here. Okay. So I would start by, since we're focusing on trees in winter, I'd like you to think about what you already know about trees. And oh my, look, we're having arguments with the computer. Okay. What you look for when you're looking for trees, at trees in winter. This is why I think it's great to be looking at trees in winter, is because they're so gorgeous. And even whether they're evergreens like the ones in the back there, or this deciduous tree, I think we get to see a lot more of the trees, at least the deciduous trees, in winter. We get to see a lot more of their structure and some other parts of what they look like. And we're going to be talking about those. So we think about what we might be looking for in the summer. Most of us are looking at leaves, I think, and what you look for at winter. And I'm hoping I'm going to be able to give you some things to think about looking for in winter and summer, quite frankly, that maybe you weren't looking as much before. Our focus is going to be this afternoon to be looking a little bit more at the whole tree. And although we can't talk about everything, I'm going to talk about, I think, at least 3 very large things. There are wonderful things to be considering about shape, about bark, and about twigs. We're not going to be talking about seeds and fruit and the environment so much, but I hope that you will consider those things in the future. And I wanted to say at the beginning that the point of my presentation today is not so much to be making it so that you can identify, exactly 24 trees down to the species, but so you'll know what to look for and maybe why you're looking at it and what makes it interesting. So let's get started with shape. Oh, my goodness. There's a lot to be said about shape. I'm going to spend a little time on this particular slide. And again, I'm used to being able to interact with people even on a Zoom. So I'm going to assume some things that you might be thinking as you're looking at these different pictures of trees and these different shapes. What do you notice about them? What do you see in their shape? Why don't we start with the middle tree, which I'm guessing most people might recognize, perhaps. That's a white pine. And what would you say about its branches? I think you would say that they're fairly horizontal, particularly if you look in comparison to at least one of the trees down in the lower right photograph, what looks like black and white. It would just happen to be a horrifically gray day when that picture was taken. And can you see some differences between those branches in that lower right photograph? Can you see that the tree on the left in that photograph how would you describe those branches in comparison to the branches of the tree on the right in that photograph? The tree on the left, relatively straight branches, not so horizontal, not quite vertical, but certainly reaching up more. The branches on the right tree, though, would you describe them that way? I would probably say they look a little bit more craggy, a little bit more twisty. But if we want to talk about interesting twists, how about the trees that are in the upper right photograph? This one right here. Can you guys see my cursor? Okay.
I don't think we
Those
can, Susan.
You can't? Okay.
I don't think I can, but I don't know if that holds true for everybody.
Okay, I'll just try to be sure that I'm doing well with my directions. So the upper right photograph, they're even a little bit twisty in a different way. As I go along, since I'm not sure, a lot of people will want to know what kinds of trees we are looking at, even though the ID isn't quite my point at the moment. My point is to look. The evergreen in the center is a white pine, and white pine very typically has horizontal branches. Not absolutely horizontal, but fairly horizontal. And in the lower right photograph, the tree on the left is a red maple, and it typically has those straighter branches. Whereas that tree in the left, excuse me, on the right in the gray photograph on the bottom is a red oak. And oak has kind of a little bit more going on with its branches. It's got a little more texture, a little bit more cragginess. But that picture up on the upper right has an even different kind of twist. This is actually a not native tree. It's a black locust. You'll very often see them in hedgerows and edges. Very distinctive looking tree. We haven't even touched on the tree on the left. I wonder if anybody has any idea about what the tree on the left is. I don't know if we're getting any things in the chat. It's a little hard for me to get to the chat on my screen.
Susan, we've had a couple things in the chat.
Okay.
Someone had said about your first tree, the very, very first one, less divided, straighter. Someone is saying for the question you just had, red spruce.
Very close. No cigar, as they say, but very, very close. I'm so glad it looks like a spruce.
Someone else says black spruce.
Black spruce. Ding, 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 ding. Right you are. Right you are. One of the ways, if you were at the scene where this black spruce was, that you'd feel really confident it was a black spruce, because this is at an edge of a bog. And black spruce are one of the few things that can grow in that very difficult environment and substrate. Black spruce seem to love to suffer because that's a suffering kind of environment. That's a real difficult environment to grow. Black spruce are also typically very straight, very narrow, don't have much crown, and that crown doesn't go out very far because they don't have much to gather from the soil. Black spruce grow in the heart, some of the hardest places. They are very typical in and around bogs, and don't know if any. I miss having people and voices. Black spruce also will be in the alpine zone, part of the crummels. They're very, 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 very tough trees. And the reason why I would know this is black spruce is just probably because see how there's a bunch of them around there, and they're just all that tall, narrow, minimal crown. I do want to, I bonus points to who says a black spruce, but again, I really want you to try to think about what you're seeing for shape, because, I think we can all think back to a point where we might not have even appreciated the difference, when we were tiny, about difference between an evergreen and deciduous tree. But once you start looking at things, you're going to see things. Let's see what our next slide is about. This is actually a sort of a random photograph. It's view out one part of my yard. There are at least 3 definite tree types that you can see here. In perhaps I would say the forefront, the closest to us, there's that white tree, which is very distinct, and probably most of us would recognize that because of its color. It's a birch. It happens to be a white birch, paper birch. The gray tree, I'll try my cursor again just in case anybody can see it. But going over just past the middle and leaning a little bit towards the right is a sizable tree. And look at the armature on that. What might you notice about it? I hope it's reminiscent of one of the 2 gray trees we were looking at in the composite photograph that I had, the composite slide of several different pictures. See how the branches aren't quite so terribly straight, little bit of cragginess to them. That's a red oak. And behind them, particularly behind the birch, you see some horizontal lines coming out again from a white pine, very large, mature white pine, has a broken top, but white pine. So just with a little bit of information, you can start seeing differences.
Susan, we had a question of how is black spruce different from Norway spruce?
Okay. Well, different in where they grow, different cones. I'm going to very quickly check because I think Norway spruce is a very, I don't know if anyone, can you see me, by the way? I'm waving my arms here around trying to demonstrate how something looks, and that's not very helpful, is it? Norway spruce is kind of a droopy spruce. It has these very, draping twigs coming off of its branches. It's very elegant. It has a large cone. Its cones are easily several inches as compared to spruce cones, which are relatively small. They, compared to a black spruce in particular, it wouldn't be happy in that environment. Norway spruce are more particular. They're going to enjoy not only full light, but they're going to enjoy soil that isn't super saturated to the point of not having enough nutrients and oxygen. Yeah. I'm not sure if that helps that person with their question or not, but hopefully you can let me know, Landair, from the chat if we're covering it.
Thank you, Susan. I think that's great.
All right. Any thoughts about these 2 trees? Are you noticing anything different in what we might call the armature and how its branches come out, how its needles are resting? What are you noticing about it? The tree on the left is our friend, the eastern white pine again. Got that horizontal look. It's it's growing in an open field, so it's quite well endowed, if you will. It's growing very fully. But the tree on the right, well, it looks like it's an evergreen. I mean, it's pictures taken in the winter. It has needles on it. Its arms are kind of going out, but does it really look the same? Any thoughts from folks about how you characterize what I would call its armature or its structure? Notice how its tips are kind of going up. Long time ago, when my brother was teaching me this tree, which is a red pine, he talked about it being candelabra-like. I don't think we'd say there's anything candelabra-like about the white pine. The red pine has that bit coming up like a candelabra.
Susan, someone in the chat box said branches coming up like a candle right before you mentioned it. So
gosh, I paid all the people well in advance. Thank you for that. Excellent. All right, let's look at a couple more trees. What do you notice? What do you see? What differences do you see? Now, both of these trees were taking pictures in winter, but don't they look awfully different? The tree on the left, I wish I could see my cursor. Trying to show you that it looks vase shaped, doesn't it? These are mature trees, very vase shaped. It's going arching out on either side. But this tree over on the right, it's got several clues about it. It not only has these very droopy twigs hanging down, but they have some color to them, don't they? Which is very typical of a willow. And the tree on the left being the famous American elm that we don't have too many more of around. This elm is not too far away from where I live. And I remember being so shocked when I first really looked at it and said, oh my gosh, there's an elm. We don't have that many of them. All right. All right. I chose this picture just so that, having been talking about shape, can you start to see some differences between these trees so that you might start to be thinking about what they are and what the differences are? I'll just step through what's here. In the forefront, right here, we have some evergreens with rather pointed tops. And these are often referred to, of this particular species of tree, as if they're like church spires, because these trees are typically very narrow at the top, that the top part of the tree is elongated and stays narrow as it grows that way. These are balsam fir. In the background, back here, standing up here, I bet most of you are probably well versed now, if you weren't before, in seeing the horizontal lines of white pine. And the trees here are actually a bit of a mixture. There's a couple different kinds in there. If I remember right, there's kind of a mixture of some maple saplings and some birch and some, don't think there's too much poplar, because poplar branches would be looking super craggy. But again, you can start, and this is just from a roadside. As you're driving down the road, you're going to start seeing and noticing different kinds. You can think about how many kinds you're seeing and thinking about, as you start looking, you're going to start surprising yourself with recognizing trees even at a distance. There's one other thing I'd like to point out in this picture. If you look in the lower left quarter of the picture, if you can see some brown in here, a little bit of kind of tan. This is another piece to be aware of that might help you identify trees in winter. You may or may not be familiar with this term of marcescence. Very impressive to use on your friends, all those syllables. Marcescence refers to the pattern of some trees, notably where we are, oaks and American beeches, that retain their leaves through much of the winter. And I continue to try to read about marcescence, and as of yet, there are a number of different theories about why they may hold on to their leaves. But I don't think we have anything in the science community saying that of absolute certainty about what's happening, but it's pretty neat. It's pretty beautiful. It adds yet another interesting color in the landscape, and it's a clue for you when you're looking at trees in the winter about what you might be looking at. I'm going to pause here before we go on to bark to see if anybody has any other questions or comments that they wanted to share about shape.
Thank you, Susan. People have been putting things in the chat box. Someone said the descriptive vocabulary is very helpful, and thank you for that. And then there were some other comments about what the various, like the willow and the elm looked like veins or droopy branches. And then people were hopping in with identifying these beech trees as well. So there is some interaction happening on the chat box, in the chat box. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. I will tell just a little story about marcescence that I hope people will find amusing. Well over a number of decades ago, once upon a time when I was very young, and I had just moved where I am here in China, Maine, and I decided to go out skiing, and it was getting dark, and I would pause. I would cross-country skiing. I would pause, and I would hear this noise, and I thought something's behind me, and then it would stop, and I'd get going again, and I'd sort of hear it. It would be a little different. And I'd hear it again, and I'd stop. And I think, my goodness, something's in the woods. And eventually I learned that that was just the beech leaves rattling in the breeze while I was going through the woods. All right. Ah, bark.
Susan,
I'm
Susan,
sorry,
if
go
I
ahead.
could interrupt you, there is a question in the chat box about the difference between beech and aspen.
Okay. Well, we are going to see some aspen bark in a moment. That will be one way that you might be able to tell the difference between the two. Another way is that a beech has an ovate leaf that comes much more to a point, where an aspen leaf is, how can I describe an aspen leaf?
Okay, Susan, I'm going to interrupt you again because it was actually birch and aspen, not beech and aspen. I misspoke.
That's okay. That's all right. And I'm guessing that person is thinking about the birches that we're the most familiar with, which probably are white or paper, and gray, which is very much like white, but doesn't feel quite the same way. Yellow birch, which looks a little bit different, but all of these are sort of peeling barks. And aspen, or what some of us call the barks are different, and I'm going to be able to show you that in a moment. That's one thing. There will be difference in the twigs, but I'd like to get to twigs and some of the details to look at to talk about that. But a birch leaf and an aspen leaf are not shaped quite the same. I'm sorry, can you tell me again, Martha, whether you guys can see me or not? The reason I'm asking is if I can hold something up to show you, I will.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I was muted. Yes, we can see you. You're a small rectangle in the corner.
Okay. And we want to know about the difference between birch and aspen. I'm trying to find some pictures very quickly that I'm hoping you might be able to see. Not all birch leaves are quite alike. But one thing that's very distinctive about aspen, if you can see me, I will try to make this clear. Is that, it's not very clear, isn't it? Is it? I can see that. There.
And the person who just asked the question is now saying in winter, question mark.
Oh, for me, I think the easiest thing is the bark. Yeah. Okay. And let's move ahead with that. Sorry to postpone your answer. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a true confession to make about bark. I just simply love it. It's just so gorgeous. And bark is so terribly important. And I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about what is in bark in very, very simplistic terms. There's where the wood, which is most of the wood, is not alive. There is what we think of as the bark, the outside. And then there's an area in between where the tree is alive, where water and minerals are coming up, and where the results of photosynthesis and all those lovely sugars are coming down. And we want to be aware of these aspects of the tree and I'll show you a picture with a little bit more detail, which we can get into if you want to. Just again, trying to show the difference between an outside layer, which is basically dead, and the inside wood, which is basically dead, and this thin area around that's alive and that is building both the wood in the inside and the bark on the outside, which is why, and you're going to get to see some poplar or aspen bark in the next slide. And I will spoil what the slide was originally designed to be talking about, which I'll get to in a moment. But the bark changes over time, and it changes because the tree is growing out. And the bark may start out, in that picture on the left is a younger aspen, big aspen tree, big toothed aspen tree. It has a relatively smooth bark. It will, as it's growing, start getting little broken diamonds, if you will. You can see a little bit of that in the middle photo, which is a slightly older tree, but you can see it starting to break a bit. And then the picture on the right is a very mature poplar. I didn't take these all equidistant and make sure that I was treating them exactly the same, and I'm sorry about that. So don't pay too much attention to their width, but do pay attention to how different they look and how the age of this tree results in a difference in the bark, so that as you're all becoming attuned to looking at things and considering how you might walk through the woods, never even seeing the canopy, but just looking at the bark, you can think about what kind of tree it is based on the pattern that it has. And in poplar, in aspen, it does typically have these sort of diamond-like shapes. If you look at the middle, you may see a couple of them, not perfect diamonds, there's more like crosses actually. And then when it becomes very, very mature, it's a very deep ridged, still has a little bit of a pattern of some diamonds to it, but mainly these deep ridges and crevices in the tree. And that's from the tree expanding out. That's what happens with bark. Now, we're talking about how to tell aspen from birch, I believe, if I've got that straight. Well, birch has a peeling bark, right? As it's growing out, it bursts in places and pieces of the bark come off, and new bark that's been growing. I'm going to take us back for a little second here. New bark that's growing out because there's a cork layer that gets built and pushed out over time regularly. So that's that new birch bark coming along. Okay. Any more immediate questions? We're still going to talk about some more bark, but I didn't know if there was anything that anybody wanted to address before we went on to.
We do have a couple questions. One is aspen native? And the other one is, let me just, are aspens and poplars in the same family?
Great question, and gives me an opportunity to talk about something. Yes, aspen are native. And would you say the second question again, so I make sure I'm focusing on exactly what they wanted? They are native.
And are aspens and poplars in the same family?
They are. They're synonyms for the same tree. And that's one thing about common names. When we use Latin names, and I don't use Latin names when I'm talking to folks, I don't even use Latin names that much myself. When you use a Latin name, it's very, very specific, and it's agreed on around the world about what the tree is. Where and when I grew up, we called trees that are aspens, we didn't even call them poplar, we called them popples. another name for the same tree. And poplar is a generic term that encompasses a couple types of aspen. We actually have two types of aspen in Maine. One is the big tooth aspen, and that's the bark we were looking at back here, big tooth aspen. And we also have, oh gosh, just quaking aspen, which doesn't have quite as large a leaf and quite the indentations in its leaf.
So are those both native to Maine is a question that someone
Yes.
has?
Yeah, both those aspens are native to Maine.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Gosh, people are asking good questions. All right. This is just another example I wanted to show you of how bark changes over time. These are some pictures from a great book on bark. This is, I don't think I can get this in focus, but I have it listed at the end of the slides. Wonderful book on bark. And one of the reasons it is so wonderful is because the gentleman who wrote it makes sure to present bark at different ages. This is a page right out of his book, and this is red maple. Red maple will start out, red maple saplings and smaller trees will be very smooth, as the upper left picture shows. Then they start, as they get bigger, to start to crack a bit, and then they start to flake. And when they're very mature, it's a very platy, flaky bark. And one of the other things there's a lot of great things about, I would say Wojtek, but I'm not sure I'm saying his last name right. And one of the things about the Barkman's book is that he helps you gives you some wonderful ways to think about and use terminology, whether it's ridges or plates or flakes or whatever, but wonderful descriptive terms to help think about what you're seeing.
We have a question about what makes the bark change as it ages.
That's what we were talking about in terms of growth. The tree is growing out. And think about it. If your skin didn't change, didn't grow as you grow, as you're growing up, what would happen to it? The tree is producing some new cork behind that old bark, but that bark changes. It gets cracked, and different trees do different things. Birches have it peeling off. The maples, they perhaps because of what's in their cells get a bit more flaky. In our next picture, we have different kinds of ridges and plates that form. So it's the growth that causes that change. There is one tree, at least in Maine, I don't know of another. There is one tree. Most trees, their bark is going to change. Very few don't change. And we have one tree in Maine that's in that category. I guess I'll pause for a moment before we talk about these two samples that we're looking right here. Does anybody know of a tree whose bark looks the same as it ages? It's a rather special instance with bark. Its bark stays smooth. Unfortunately, this particular tree often gets a disease that affects how its bark looks, but its bark gets invaded by a scale insect and the fungus gets in there, and then the bark doesn't look so nice. Any suggestions coming into the chat, I wonder, about that?
Yes, we have a few here. Let's see.
Oh, good.
They want to know if the tree on the left is a pine, and then dogwood, ? Beech, ? From another person.
Beech is the winner. American beech. Yes, it has that smooth gray bark, not unlike the young bark of that red maple. Not unlike that. Very similar. Smooth gray, and it stays smooth and gray. And I can't explain to you why it doesn't crack or peel or whatever, but somehow it seems to get replaced and stay smooth. Very special. And somebody's getting ahead of me on our slides. Okay, so now that you're all looking at things terribly carefully, thank you so much for doing that. Would you say these are the same or different? Because I need to watch the time a little bit, we have a little bit to go, I'm going to go ahead and say they're different. And somebody, I'm not sure which side they say, but yes, the one on the right is a pine, and the one on the left is a hemlock. And we have a pair here. Well, again, just getting you to learn to look at the difference, how the pine is more ridged, you might say. The hemlock's a bit more flaky, a little more plated. I think Wojciech would say plates. And here's a tricky one. These again, we've got hemlock and pine here, but what's the difference with the trees? They look just a little different. Well, the hemlocks are younger. The pine is still a big old pine, but the hemlocks look a little younger. So the bark looks a little bit different. So again, it's a matter of getting used to how things might look at different ages. And then there's one other thing that can mess a little bit with when we're looking at bark, which is maybe the tree is ill. The tree on the far left, the kind of bumpy, I got introduced to a new term for this, the shotgun appearance. It appears to have been hit with a shotgun. That is a very, very not doing well beech. It has so much of what is commonly called beech bark disease, which is a combination of a scale insect getting in there and then being followed by a fungus, and it messes a lot with the tree. The middle tree has so much lichen on it and a bit of moss that it might be hard to tell that that's a green ash. It has a kind of a diamondy bark. I said diamondy before with poplar too, didn't I? But the ridges aren't as deep, are they? No. And then, of course, if things are really suffering a great deal and they get fungus on them, it can be hard for us to tell what's going on with them. I'm going to move on to twigs. I know I'm taking a little longer than I think we all intended, because I wanted to make sure we have some time at the end for questions. But is there anything anyone else wants to talk about with bark before I move on to twigs?
There's no new questions in the chat.
All right. Twigs. The main thing I think that would be helpful, we'll keep this a little bit short, about twigs is you'd be probably using a key in a field guide that might tell you about the twigs. The Maine Forest Services guide, which is something like $12. You couldn't get a better tree book to use in Maine. It's called The Forest Trees of Maine. If you go on the Maine government website, go look for the Department of Forestry or whatever it's called, you can get the book there. And it has a key in it specifically for looking at trees in winter. And one of the things it's going to go straight to is twigs and what you see on the twigs. So I wanted to talk about twig parts so you could know what to look for. You want to look at the buds. You'll look at whether they have one scale or multiple scales on them. You might look at the lenticels. I think probably all of you know the buds are the next year's growth, which forms in the fall. I don't know if anyone ever thought about why do the buds form in the fall? Why might that be? Well, they've had all that wonderful summertime energy. They have it so that they're ready. So in the spring, after a winter of not having so much energy come to them, they'll be in better shape to put them out. You want to look at the buds, look at the scales. Sometimes the number of the scales on the bud can help you. The lenticels. Lenticels are spots that allow for gas exchange for the tree. The leaf scar. Do you all see where, again, I don't know if you can see my cursor. I'm trying to circle it for you, where the leaf scar piece is on the diagram. How that leaf scar looks, its shape, whether it has these little dots inside, which are called bundles, bundle traces are in there. And if you break off a twig, if you look at the pith, all these pieces can be used to help identify the tree. One of the simplest things you can also do, it's a start. It's not going to get you to the exact tree, but it's going to get you a ways to it, is to identify whether the buds on the tree are opposite, as is the left photograph there, or alternate, as in the right one. whether they're across from each other and opposite or alternate. And one of the things is if they're opposite, there are more limited number of trees that they can be. This is not an original mnemonic of mine. It's a common one, to remember that viburnum, and maple, ash, dogwood, and horse chestnut all have opposite buds. So this kind of summarizes some pieces that you might look for on twigs, whether they're opposite or alternate. We talked about how many scales. Fuzziness, I didn't talk about that, but some species will literally have a little fuzz on their buds that won't be on other species, whether spines or thorns. Those leaf scars, so if you have a bud, that area, that scar that's underneath from where a leaf was in the previous season, what that looks like can be a clue. The pith we talked about, the lenticels might be relevant to what you're doing. And if you notice the shape of them, are they particularly long or round, if they're even visible? And color. Red maple twigs are red. And sugar maple twigs are not. Things like that. Now, we didn't get to talk about a number of things that you might also look for, depending on the season and depending what's around. Flowers and fruit might not be readily apparent in the wintertime. You might see evidence on the ground of them, the same way that in the wintertime you might see evidence around the ground of a tree from its old leaves, if it's a deciduous tree. We talked a little bit about the difference between where a black spruce might be and, white and red spruce can't grow where a black spruce does. So where the tree is growing can be a clue, and what it's growing in, what it's like. And if you are already into such things as particularly lichen and fungi, there are specific lichen and specific fungi that sometimes limit themselves to certain kinds of trees. That's a little bit beyond my ken. I'm only just starting to get into that, but it's something to be aware of. And I promised, I am going on. These are by no means the only resources that you might want to use, but that Forest Trees of Maine book, it hasn't been updated since 2008, but it's up to date. It's a good, simple book to use. Sibley has a guide. There are certainly other tree books that I'm sure are good. The thing that's really great about the Maine book is that it focuses on Maine. So if you're looking around at what's here, that can be good for you. And the bark book by Michael, and I'm sorry, I won't say his name right. I have no idea how to say it. I'm guessing it's Wojtek. There's a book that was put out recently by the Wild Seed Project that is valuable, called The Native Trees for the Northeast Landscapes. That's perhaps particularly useful if you're thinking about what kind of trees you want to plant if you're rewilding a part of your land. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the next person, Tom Wessels. He's an ecologist. I'm forgetting whether he's in New Hampshire or Vermont. I think it's Vermont, but anyway, he's a great one to look up and see some of his things on YouTube, but also his Reading the Forested Landscape is a great way to kind of learn about how the forest evolves before and after human intervention. And there are others, just a couple of authors here that I think are particularly interesting. And if anybody has any particular other recommendations or questions or wondering about certain kinds of books, there are different folks with different perspectives about trees. I've read a fair number. If you have some questions about some, I'm glad to recommend what I know. I don't know it all, but I'm glad to talk about it. And I guess I just really wanted to encourage you all to really look at trees, to look carefully, because there are lots of things you might see, including creatures. This was serendipitous this day I got this photo. to get the barred owl. He literally was that close to me. It was wonderful. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing some time with me. I appreciate it.
That was wonderful, Susan. There are a couple questions in the chat. One was, what are those fuzzy looking items with the long, thin leaves?
I bet you that's a few slides back, maybe. I'm not sure which thing. Shall we trip back here? Are we talking? Oh, we talking about this picture? I'm going to guess.
Yes.
All right.
Someone's guessing chestnut pods.
They are spot on. That's a chestnut leaf and some chestnut pod, and the husk, actually, the husks from around a chestnut, which I found on the ground by a very, very young chestnut, which the last time I went by it was still alive.
Nice. Awesome.
Yes, the eastern part of the United States used to be covered with those. They lost them.
Someone else was saying that I think after they saw your barred owl photo, that in the winter you can also see nests that you can't see in the summer with the foliage.
That's excellent. And I need to get some pictures to show that, because that's been actually one of the better ways that I've learned about nests is being able to see them in the winter, because they're not as easy to find, at least in deciduous trees. Excellent point. Excellent.
Have you found, Susan, or does anyone know if you identify a nest or vice versa, the tree, that might help you then identify the other? Like, are there certain birds that prefer certain trees and might help you identify birds and trees?
I don't pretend to know a great deal about bird nests, so I want that great disclaimer, but there are certainly patterns to where birds nest. And what birds want one kind of place. Hermit thrushes, ovenbirds, I think I'm thinking ovenbirds, nest on the ground versus a tree. So certain birds do have certain preferences. I'm not sure that I'm knowledgeable enough to say, oh, a chickadee's nest is always going to be in this kind of tree. It's always going to be in the hollow of a birch. That's where I've seen chickadee nests, but that doesn't mean that's the only place that they are. But yes, there are patterns. And I know that for some of the very tiny birds that I've identified their nests for, it was relevant, I think, that they were strung up where they were. I'm thinking of nests that often are in shrubs and are, I don't know how to be saying that they're literally strung up. They're not wedged into a branch, between a branch and a trunk. They're literally strung. And that kind of nest is not likely to be, for example, in a pine, because those pine needles would mess with the nest. Interesting to think about that combination of nests and trees.
Thank you for your thoughts on that. There are a lot of thank yous in the chat box. Such a lovely and fascinating session. Thank you so much. This was such a helpful refresher. Wonderful, well presented, so useful, must watch again. And then there were a couple of other questions. Martha, do you want to ask any of those?
Yes, there's one that asked, why do tree names include a color?
I'm not sure I can speak with authority for all tree names that might have color, but let's talk about a couple. We did touch on red maple, and red maple has red blossoms. It has red buds. It has reddish twigs with white lenticels on them. And it typically has a great deal of red in its leaves in the fall. And I don't know if it's the leaves, the twigs, the flowers, or the buds that might have struck somebody, but I'm guessing that that's why we talk about red maples. We have what we call red oaks, and I'm not 100% sure, but I'd wager a small piece of chocolate, not a large piece, but a small piece of chocolate, that has to do with when the tree is relatively mature, I'm sorry I don't have a picture to share of this, but when the tree is relatively mature, the bark within what might be called the grooves as compared to the ridges will have a reddish tinge to it. Not in every groove, not even necessarily in every tree, but very often you can see that in the red oak bark. So I think that while we don't associate any particular color other than brown or gray very often with some trees, so we don't say that, I think with some trees, because we're seeing something like a lot of people call paper birch white birch because it's so white. Gray birch, I can only hazard a guess, doesn't typically, never say always or never, but doesn't typically have as solid a white appearance as a paper birch. It has a bit more darkness around the bottom crotch of the branch. It has a little bit more gray on it. And it's a little messier tree in certain ways. Maybe that's why it's called gray. I think a yellow birch actually does have a kind of goldish tinge very often to its bark. It's faint, but it's there.
Great. There was a question about what time of day and year was it that you saw the owl?
The time of day, I don't know precisely, but I would estimate it was early to mid-afternoon. And it was a late winter hike. And if somebody is particularly interested, it was at the base of Haystack Mountain, Liberty. And it would have been about 3 years ago. And I literally just turned around and just sort of looked up, and there he was. Wonderful gift. And we only sometimes get those wonderful gifts because we look for them. You know, T.S. Eliot had a bit of in his poetry about how unseen because unlooked for.
Well, Susan, thank you so much for today. And thank you for letting us record this as well. As someone in the chat box indicated, they're interested in watching it again. So we will get it up on our YouTube channel, which will be on the Blue Hill Heritage Trust website, as well as Island Heritage Trust website, if anyone wants to watch it again or share it with a friend. So thank you for your time tonight and for being able to share this again with people as well. It was really fascinating and wonderful to see everyone on tonight. So thank you all for attending as well.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you all, and thank you so much.
Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Well, that was a treat, Susan. I really appreciated your way of describing things. That was wonderful. And great.
It's funny because I always start out thinking, oh, I better keep it really, you know, and then I get excited.
It's awesome.
You'd be fun to go for a walk with.
Well, I don't want to delay either one of you, but Landair, if there's anything that you'd ever like done again, I mean, you have Martha, of course. She's a Maine Master Naturalist. She probably can be doing all kinds of things with you. But trees or ferns or anything else, very glad.
Thank you so much for the offer. That's really nice. Yeah, as I said, we try to do these webinars about once a month for like September through May, and then we take a break off for the summer. So there very well may come another time when we're like, oh, we really need another Maine Master Naturalist, and we'll call upon you. So thank you for that offer.
Well, and good luck to both of you ladies with your work.
Oh, well, thank you. And we hope to have you again. That would be lovely.
Okay. Well, I'll wish you good evening.
Okay.
Right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Landon.
Susan, I'll send you a link as well to the recording if you have people you want to share it with as well.
Yes, I think I'm too terrified to look at it just now.
You You did great.
It's
Well,
so good.
that's good. My husband is constantly pointing out how I say one word when I mean another.
Oh,
So,
I didn't notice any of that, so I think you're all good.
well, thank you. You're both very kind. Have a good evening, and look forward to, I hope, our paths crossing again.
Yes.
That would be nice.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.